Well, guys, welcome to this analysis, a short analysis about the Cold War. Well, the title is quite clear. It's only an introduction. It's a list about the main events that have characterized this period that goes from the end of the Second World War up to the fall of the Berlin Wall. Anyway, just this first slide about the Cold War is important. Why? Because we have the five main protagonists, the five main characters of the Cold War. You can see, well, on the right, Joseph Stalin, the Soviet dictator, Roosevelt, the American president, and Winston Churchill, the British Prime Minister. On the left, on the contrary, you find Gorbachev and Reagan, the two presidents that we can say that actually signed the definite agreement that ended the Cold War. So please remember the name of these five main characters. In short, Joseph Stalin, Delano Roosevelt, and Winston Churchill are the three main political characters of the Second World War that characterized the 20th century. And with these three guys, we can say that the Cold War started. I want to underline again, well, we can say that the Cold War started just at the end of the Second World War, and it finished in 1989 with the fall of the Berlin Wall. Let's continue with this with the second slide. Well, actually, why cold? Why are we using this adjective to define this war and not war? Well, the Cold War, please read the definition, is the conflict that exists between the United States and Soviet Union from 1945 to 1991. Well, I repeat, guys, 1991 is the official end of the Cold War, but from the symbolical point of view, you have to remember 1989. 1991 is the political agreement signed in Paris that ended the Cold War. And it's true, cold because the two sides, that is the two superpowers, United States and Soviet Union, never went to war directly with each other. On the contrary, during the several local wars that characterized the 20th century, well, United States and Soviet Union supported other countries, but they never fought against each other. So please remember that cold because the two superpowers never fought in a battlefield with one army against another one. Let's continue with the third slide. Well, why do we call it a war? Well, actually, I repeat, guys, we have to remember a lot of local wars that have signed the 20th century, and actually we can sum up the 20th century with by saying that we had a lot of local wars between communists and anti-communists. Please remember that in the following slides we are going to analyze shortly what we mean with the adjective communist and what we mean with the adjective anti-communist. And it's true, well, it's a competition. It's a competition done on different areas, political areas, economical areas, military areas, and well, actually, at the end of the Cold War, we can say that the wealthiest, the richest country could win. The United States had the economical power that allowed it to win this Cold War. And quickly, well, I have divided the Cold War into four topics: the significance of the Cold War, causes, historical background, and events of the Cold War. Well, why we should study the Cold War? Well, actually, it's a question that is important for the American students. Probably we cannot say the same, we cannot affirm the same about the Italian students, but the Cold War characterized strongly the whole 20th century. Albeit the Italian soil, Italy, was not directly touched. Please remember that for 40 years Italy was obliged to guard, to defend its borders by using a lot of weapons against the menace coming from the eastern countries. Well, it's true. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 reasons brought the world to the brink of nuclear destruction. It's true. We are speaking about two superpowers that have the nuclear, the atomic, that possess, that own the atomic bombs. And the explosion of the atomic bombs, as we saw during the Second World War, could result in a total destruction for the whole world. It's true, it was the direct cause of the US wars in Korea and Vietnam. Please remember that generally I'm speaking about a lot of local wars, but mainly we have to underline the Korean War and the Vietnam Wars. Well, these two wars are surely the most important conflicts that we have to cite. The race, the space race, very famous, led to the 1969 moon landing. But please remember that actually the first satellite to orbit around the planet was Soviet. It's true, this Cold War is, well, the Cold War was very expensive. So we also nowadays we had to speak about a large US-American national debt. And it's true, shaped the post-World War II era. And also nowadays we can speak by considering the tensions coming from the modern Russia with the President Putin. We can say that also nowadays our political situation, our economic situation is directly affected by this tension, this sort of political and economical conflict. To the brink of nuclear destruction, already said. Please remember that we are speaking about two superpowers that possess the atomic bombs. And I repeat, guys, if you have a look at the effects that an atomic explosion could have on a land, please remember Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I repeat, wars in Korea and Vietnam were two difficult wars for the United States, and these two wars, well, apparently were fought to contain the spread of communism. And unfortunately, we can say that the American army decisively won the war in Korea, but on the other side, in Vietnam, the U.S. Army was forced to withdraw from the South Vietnam. And in fact, at the end of the Vietnam War, well, we can say of a total affirmation of communism in this far part of the eastern planet. And to the moon, the space, the famous race to get the moon. Well, they both the Soviet Union and the United States spent a lot of money to demonstrate that their technologies were superiors. And well, welcome back to the second part about the explanation of the Cold War. For topic, the fourth topic that characterizes this presentation, we are still paying. I repeat, the Cold War was really expensive, and the Cold War was responsible for the fall of the Soviet economy. In fact, the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, but this is only a year to define better the collapse of the Soviet Union was just began also in the 80s. We are still paying. Let's continue. Well, some important event to remember. Well, why is there a North and South Korea? Please remember that this is a topic that is one of the most important news that we are following nowadays. Please remember the problem that we have between Trump and the Korean dictator. We have to remember also the division that Berlin suffered, a division that at first was only yes, political, but in 1961 we have the real construction of a wall that divided Berlin into two areas. A large wall that sign the birth of West Berlin and East Berlin. Please remember that at the end of the Second World War, at first Berlin was divided into four large areas. One area was ruled by the Americans, one by the French, another by the British, and the fourth area by the Soviets. In the following years, France and England couldn't maintain this sort of control on Berlin, and Berlin was politically ruled by the United States and by the Soviet Union. Shaping the war, yes, please remember that from 1945 up to 1991, well, this period characterized the whole political and economical situation all over the world. What caused the Cold War? Well, please remember that the tensions, when we are speaking about the Cold War, we have to find the roots of this Cold War just during the Second World War. The alliance among United States, USSR, and United Kingdom was not so stable. So some tensions just started during the Second World War. Winston Churchill didn't trust Joseph Stalin. Winston Churchill was totally against the communism and all the ideas coming from the Soviet Union. And also the Americans, also Roosevelt, saw in the Joseph Stalin's policy a sort of attempt to control a large part of the world. So there wasn't any trust among these three characters. I repeat, Joseph Stalin, Delano Roosevelt, and Winston Churchill. You can say you can see in this slide causes philosophical differences, but actually, post-war conflicts wanted. Please remember that when we are speaking about tension that we have during the Second World War, is about the Joseph Stalin's desire to have a second front in Europe. Please remember that from 1941 up to 1944, with the landing in Normandy, the Soviet Union was the only country to face the German attacks and the Hitler's desire to dominate Europe. And Stalin wanted to open a second front, and this second front was to make the Soviet effort a little lighter. So please remember that we had a lot of misunderstandings between Joseph Stalin on one side and Churchill and Roosevelt on the other one. Mistras already said, actually Churchill didn't trust Stalin, and I think he was right. Roosevelt, was geographically far from the Europe, so Roosevelt followed Winston Churchill's opinion. And it's true. At the end of the Second World War, Stalin, the U.S. felt that. Please remember that Roosevelt died in 1945, and we had a new president, Truman, and the U.S. Truman felt that Stalin had broken promises about the free election in Eastern Europe, and in fact, Stalin tried, and he was successful in that, tried to control the whole Eastern European countries. And this control lasted for about 40 years. Competition for power? It's true. A new world order. Two ideas, two political ideas, two different economies. Americans, United States and the Soviet Union wanted two different orders. And they disagreed about everything. Ideologies, I repeat, communism and capitalism. Please remember that is true. The example of the communism in the Soviet Union led to the dictatorship of Joseph Stalin. But please remember that if we analyze some negative features, some negative aspects of the capitalism, we cannot affirm that the capitalism is completely good. We have also some cons that concern the capitalism. What is communism? Well, guys, please remember that I'm sure that you have already studied that in history. Well, at the base of the communism, we have Karl Marx with his famous document written in 1848 entitled the Manifesto. And, well, you can find the main ideas on communism. Albeit, well, in the Soviet Union, this communism, the starting ideas about communism were soon transformed into a real dictatorship. Well, abolition of private property. Well, please remember, generally when we want to explain the communism, well, we say that the communism doesn't allow the growth of the individual. Well, everything should be done for the country, for the nation, and well, the private property, the famous American dream, is not possible under a communist country. Well, abolishes all religion, abolishes all eternal truth. Please remember that communism abolishes all religion, and well, we should make a long speech about the Jew religion, about the approach that Stalin had with the Jew people. So, well, it's a long discourse, but please remember, communism abolishes all religion. Let's continue very quickly. Well, you have a summary about the communism. Communism favors collective or community ownership of property. Well, communists seek to overthrow existing government in revolution. Well, this is a typical sentence that you had to remember when you studied the famous October Revolution in Russia in 1917. And why did Americans dislike it? Well, guys, please remember that we can criticize strongly the United States, but we have to acknowledge that, well, the United States followed, and it's true also nowadays, followed a policy that allowed everyone to live according to his desire, to live on your own. Well, a sort of personal freedom that the communism didn't give. So manifest communism discouraged hard work and promoted laziness. Communism took away personal freedom and individuality. I think that this is the most important sentence to remember about took away personal freedom. And please remember that when we are speaking about the United States, we have to affirm that, well, it's a sort of sacred thing, the personal freedom in the United States. Was opposed to religion. Well, the United States is the land of a lot of religions. United States allows every kind of religion. This is not true under a communist country. Well, obviously we have some differences. And was a brutal dictatorship. Well, I wouldn't attribute the communism, or I wouldn't match communism and dictatorship. Well, please remember that Stalin transformed the communism he shaped the communism as a dictatorship, but actually we cannot affirm that the communism is a dictatorship or equals a dictatorship. Depends also on the political leaders. Historical background, the Russian Revolution. Please remember that you have already studied that in history. a civil war erupts. USSR, please remember that up to 1991 we have to speak about the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. So from 1922 up to 1991. And up to 1991 we can count 14 large republics. Stalin comes to power, post-war disagreement. Well, I have already underlined this disagreement among Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin. Well, in the picture, well, you can see Truman. The U.S. wanted a democratic world sharing American values. And when you're speaking about American values, please think of personal freedom and, well, I would say also the typical American dream that is at the base of our conception of the American spirit. The US wanted a community of nations committed to free trade. Well, I would say also that committed to free trade led by the United States itself. And the USSR, what did the USSR want? Well, actually, well, Stalin was hungry, well, of power. And in fact, he was successful in controlling East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and Poland. So he was successful in controlling the Eastern Europe. Well, alliance fades into conflict. Well, I have already said this sort of why didn't Truman tell Stalin when he would use the atomic bomb in Japan? Because remember that actually it's true. Well, the first country that used the atomic bomb was just the United States. So Stalin didn't consider this a positive behavior, a positive example coming from the Western countries. You have a summary. Well, the World War II alliance between the US and the USSR should really be seen as a temporary arrangement. It's true. Please remember that the German danger represented by Hitler was faced by this well, alliance made of United States, Soviet Union, and United Kingdom. But in spite of this alliance, well, there were deep differences in politics, economics, and history. And obviously, at the end, after having defeated Hitler, well, these differences broke up and the Cold War started. Well, you can see some map in this map represents the world in 1959. If you notice, we have a large red area that represent the communist countries. And significant events, well, Yalta Agreements, I repeat, well, the famous picture with Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin. Early tensions just at the end of the Second World War. Well, it's not important. Well, it's important, but it's not necessary to remember this Cannon's telegram. Famous Iron Curtain speech. Well, in this speech, Winston Churchill, well, told the whole world about the menace, about the danger represented by the Soviet Union, and he warned of the growing of Soviet power. And yes, and some consider this speech a declaration of a real declaration of Cold War. Truman Doctrine. Please remember that Truman tried to support the Western European countries that had to face the new Soviet power. Truman Doctrine. Well, I repeat. Please remember that Truman replaced Roosevelt a command of the United States. The Marshall Plan, the famous Marshall Plan, also Italy could exploit this plan that actually was a big loan to support the reconstruction of the European countries. The containment, well, US Cold War policy in one word. When I say containment, well, I can translate that into Italian by using politica di contenimento. Well, to face the Soviet danger, the Soviet attempt to control the world. Well, Berlin airlift, well, please remember the attempt to help Berlin, and in this picture you can say the division of Berlin. Please remember that I didn't say anything about Germany. Germany was divided into two parts, West Germany and East Germany. On the contrary, Berlin was divided at first into 4 areas, and then we had only 2 areas. NATO, well, the NATO was a sort of organization that had to avoid or had to face the growing, the rising power, the rising military powers of the USSR. Please remember that it's interesting to notice that the USSR menace, well, was not so clear in 1949. In fact, after the birth of NATO, well, the USSR tried to counter the NATO by forming the Warsaw Pact in 1955. Year of fear, well, in the picture, well, you can say the famous Chinese leader Mao Zedong. Well, it's true, and in 1949, also Stalin was able to make an experiment by having the first explosion of the atomic bomb. Well, let's continue. The Korean War, already said, one of the most important war during the after the end of the Second World War. Well, please remember that the main protagonist, the main character of this war was MacArthur, that could defeat the North Korean army. Well, you have in front of you the key events. Well, conclusion: the Cold War continued until the late 1980s, when communism collapsed in Eastern Europe. Well, I repeat, due above all to the economical reason. And events that we'll study in the coming week, well, guys, please remember, well, it's not necessary to study these other events. I hope that you have understood the